Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1020th New Social Embankment on this windy, windy day in Brooklyn. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Brooklyn Rail, and I have the extreme privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Marie Rooney, Julia Rooney, and Ginevra de Blasio. We'll conclude today with a poetry reading from Marie Rooney. And now I'll introduce Marie, Julia, and Ginevra. Marie Rooney is a poet and artist living in Baltimore. She's the author of No Beautiful and Spitshine, as well as 2 chapbooks. Her poetry has been twice featured in the Best American Poetry Anthology and has been the recipient of the Iowa Review Award, the Gulf Coast Poetry Prize, the Amy Award, the Freund Prize, and others. With the artist and game designer Sam Sheffield, she creates poetic games as LORRAINE. She hosts Poem on the Radio, a bi-weekly discussion of a single poem on WGDR's Still Life with Club Soda. Julia Rooney is a visual artist based in New York City and New Haven, sensitive to the increasing power that digital, virtual, and augmented realities command. She creates paintings and site-specific installations grounded in real space, analog material, and the human body. Her work has been in solo and group exhibitions at Below Grand, Freight and Volume, and many other spaces. And she's been awarded residencies and grants through the Joan Mitchell Center, Yale University Art Gallery, and many others. She holds an MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale School of Art. And our host today, Ginevra de Blasio, is a writer and curator from Rome, now based in New York City. She graduated with a BA in art history and visual culture from the University of Exeter in England in 2021 and has an MA in visual arts and administration from NYU. Ginevra had curatorial and work experiences at the Drawing Center, Performa, Fondazione Corsini, and 99 Canal. Currently, she holds the position as assistant to partners at Paula Cooper and as research assistant to Adam Weinberg, Director Emeritus of the Whitney Museum of American Art. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Ginevra.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the Brooklyn Rail for organizing and to Julian and Marie for being open to discussion about their wonderful exhibition that just opened at Below Grand. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about why I was so drawn to this exhibition. And I would start by saying that I was walking around Lower Manhattan, and then all of a sudden you find yourself with this vitrine, brightly lit vitrine, and a series of small paintings hanged in a salon-like aesthetic. And exactly like in the image. But then you notice that this vitrine is framed by graffiti, a whole sign that has been blurred by time, and stickers all over the place. And you realize that there is a level of conceptuality in it. And I visualized it a lot like an extension of New York City in many ways. But before getting into this more conceptual reading of the show, I wanted to begin with a question addressing the collaborative nature of the show. And so Julian and Marie, that are 2 sisters, have been working for a long time through mail, but this was the first time that they were actually collaborating in the same space through a residency program. And so I was wondering if we could start by talking a bit about the influence, both directly and indirectly, that this had on your work and on this show.
Thank you so much, Ginevra, for that first question. And thank you so much to the Brooklyn Rail and everyone who's here on your lunch break or right after lunch. So I think that's such a good question about collaborative space. I would say we haven't lived together since 2003 when I left Lower Manhattan, our childhood home, for college. And so kind of as a necessity, our collaboration started by exchanging mail, by passing notes, kind of some of which are pictured here, back and forth through the mail. We started to feel like mail, like the USPS was kind of a way of exhibiting, in a sense, which was especially deepened by the fact when we learned that the USPS actually scans every piece of mail that is sent, almost like, artwork would be photographed or cataloged. So Julia can speak to this a little bit more, but she began to actually scan and index all of the mail that I sent her. So maybe you can speak to this image, Julia.
Sure. Yeah. And I just want to second the thanks to everybody for their presence here and the invitation to share our work with you. So this is a digital image showing a selection of pieces of mail that Anne-Marie sent me. And this is all actually from the period of 2016 to 18. And it was this like accumulation of objects that, again, at the beginning, I was just sort of holding. It was like I was just kind of becoming a reservoir for these things that I was receiving. And then at a certain point, I started to see these kind of like similarities or through lines between certain pieces of mail specifically. So out of like truly hundreds of pieces of mail that Anne-Marie sent me, this is the kind of index, you might call it, of string. So these are all of the objects that in some way sort of riffed off of or included actual string. Another example of a form of indexing, which I should also note is something that is very near and dear to Anne-Marie and I both. Our father is a professional indexer, which means that he reads books in their final stages of publication and writes the index for the book. So his way of thinking about language and sort of the ways that text is organized in an index, I would say is like something that we've both sort of has diffused into our consciousness as we've grown up. So this is a piece on the left, you see it's a freestanding screen, and what's the kind of like grid-like structure inside of it is actually mail that is all, again, sent from Anne-Marie that's been taped together and kind of assembled into this this screen. And then on the right is a kind of accompanying work that shows date by date these kind of pieces of correspondence that we've exchanged, both by email and by mail, by physical mail, I should note. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then I'll also say that going back to your question about this residency, Ginevra, the first time that we'd actually been in shared space together in 18 or 19 years at the Soaring Gardens Artist Retreat, we had just the serious fortune of being able to share the studio space, which belonged to artist Aura Lerman, which was one of the most beautiful spaces I've ever worked in no small part because I was sharing it with Julia. And we would, just as when we were children, we would literally pass notes back and forth across the studio floor. When I got tired of editing a poem, I might pass it to her, she might paint on it. I paint myself, but I infrequently have the space and the ventilation to oil paint, but I would take paint off of her palette and use that in my own work. She might give me a piece of cast off canvas. And here are just two kind of process shots of how we worked across the studio from each other.
And I think it speaks to the sort of shared aesthetic of like found objects and really utilizing both like the floor and the wall in this way that I really do think is a creative space for both of us and sort of factors into later in the show how we end up installing.
Definitely.
And in terms of like now grounding this collaboration back to the exhibition and the show, I know that the titles of the paintings featured all derived from a poem that Anne-Marie wrote. And so I kind of reflected on that, and I was thinking that what this exhibition was doing more is blurring the boundaries between these two artistic mediums and exploring and showing how poetry can be visual and how painting can be poetry at the same time. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how these mediums live in this other place in a way.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I just, I'll jump in and just say, I feel like poetry is the closest medium to painting in a sense, because the way I experience it is it's like this distillation of meaning to like it's like the common denominators, like you can't distill it anymore. It's so, every word is so important. And when I think about what I aspire to in painting, it is that everything on the canvas has to be there. There's nothing that's extraneous, but also there's nothing else that could be done. There's no other way to compress it. And this image here, Emery could talk a little bit about it as well, is just two examples of, again, some of our earlier collaborations that involve each other's objects and language. So the painting on the left is mine, but the words in it are taken from memory and sort of abstracted. And then the piece on the right, Emery could speak to maybe.
Yeah, so this is another scan of some of the objects. I will lovingly call them detritus in the most loving way that I send Julia. And I think she visited me in Baltimore, where I'm currently based, maybe 2018. And we started to kind of arrange them just on a flatbed scanner and scan them in. But yeah, I also love this question about, you know, is poetry visual, is painting literary? And I'll say that personally, I view painting as more playful, perhaps lower stakes to me. And I was trying to kind of like puzzle through why this was before this talk. And it might be just because I have less formal training in it. So again, if I'm tired of staring at words, I often turn to paint or collage or found media. But just in terms of my poetry in specific, I would call myself more of a lyrical poet than narrative. I am interested in narrative, but maybe not A to B. I want the narrative to be kind of smudged a little bit. I'm more interested in sounds and textures and feelings and forms. And I think Julia will be speaking a little bit later to, you know, the importance of frames in her work and in this show. But, you know, I think a lot about how a poem is a frame, a form is a frame, a sonnet is a frame, a postcard is a frame, and how having those frames, whether visual or literary, offers a freedom in a way when that choice is removed. I'll also say that my third manuscript, which is what I was mostly working on at residency, it's called Spidering. It's not published yet, but it is specifically about embodiment, painting, language, gender. And it uses an epigraph from Julia, which I love, which is paintings enter moments of crisis. And I think poems can enter moments of crisis too, but that those are really, really rich junctures.
And to that, maybe like really specifically to your question, Ginevra, about like how this manifested at the residency was, there was, so I was working, as you saw maybe in the other image, I was working on all these small oil paintings, all of which really started as found frames. So all of the frames that you see were actually the way that the painting began, as opposed to an afterthought that was put on after the painting was done. And at a certain point, I had accumulated enough of these paintings, but had yet to title them. And usually titles are something that I sort of take a generic approach to. I sometimes number my paintings in a kind of very just like factual way, not trying to imbue them with any narrative meaning or language. But in this case, Amory shared with me this poem, which is on the left, called ESP. And she could speak a little bit to how this poem evolved, but there were so many moments in it which felt like these really concise thoughts that, again, did not describe what was going on in the painting, but offered yet another way to understand it as both a visual and then this like this object that had like language attached to it in some way. So the paintings ended up all being named using lines from this poem of Anne Marie's. And that poem also, I would say, ends up in the show in one of Anne Marie's sculptures, that actual physical, like hand, like, you know, marked up piece of text. So that's in a really direct way how the poetry and the painting, one of the ways in which it shows up in this particular exhibition.
And another way in which I noticed that it lives more in the visual realm is the way that you transcribed and you decided to transcribe the poetry in the space. So there were instances exactly like in the picture that they were transcribed in these hidden corners and ceiling. And also on the floor, you decided to transcribe a poem using chalk. And I found that extremely interesting because the experience of the audience is almost explorative when approaching the space. And so I was wondering if you thought about that, and how did you predict that, and why the choice of this transitory, let's say, medium instead of something a bit more permanent. And also you use pencil for the transcribe on the wall. So I was wondering if you could speak about that.
Sure. I love those words, exploratory and transitive, or explorative and transitory. Yes. Yes, that's exactly it. I feel like people, and myself very much included, don't always know how to relate to poetry. I don't always know how to relate to poetry. Poetry is often, I'm looking around for a book, poetry is often in this very slim volume, closed, flat on the page. And I wanted it to be more embodied in this exhibit. Why did it have to be here? Why did it have to be in a gallery? And it was really working with our wonderful curator, Amanda Mille-Sorsa, that we began to think through more of, how can we bring the body of the viewer and the reader into kind of conversation with the poetry on the floor and in the wall? How does it change our reading of the poem if we have to kind of strain a little bit to look at it in a corner? If it's in pencil and we wonder, should it be there? Is this something I should be looking at? How do we view a poem maybe differently if it's on the floor in chalk in this very, very vulnerable medium? And we have to figure out, am I going to step on this? Is this meant to smudge? I love in the next image that Julia took, the boots, the wet boots. The show is called In the Weather of It, but there was so much weather during our opening, and actually yesterday or Saturday, the day that the gallery was open as well. And again, I wondered, do visitors to the gallery want to step on the poem? Or is it, by virtue of being in a gallery, almost too precious? Do they want to kind of walk around the poem? And I want viewers to ask those questions, sometimes uncomfortably, but always in a way that brings them back to their bodies. My body is in this small space, and I have to figure out how I'm going to read. I would also say, to your question about kind of anticipating how a viewer or a reader might be in conversation with the work, I always feel like, how to say this? I always feel like once my work is out there in the world, I don't control it anymore. I can't control how people are going to read it or respond to it or interpret it. And that lack of control is scary, but also kind of exciting to me in a way. And I think that might be why I kind of want to play with lack of control in the chalk here. The idea that, again, the poem could get smudged. The sculpture could get wet, or going back to our mail art collaboration, the mail might not reach its destination. So that's kind of juicy to me.
And I mean, this fits perfectly also with your choice to incorporate most of the times found materials. And so from the more visible ones that can be, the frames, to even the more researched ones, like I know that the paper that you used to print the poems was also found. And so I was wondering if you could talk about, this connection with an interest towards found objects that it talks a lot about also New York City in a way, and our relationship with the street.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I have to give 100% of the credit, I think, to both my and Julia's obsession with rust and found things in general, and then in specific to the scavenging of this rust, to our mother, Erica Milak Rooney. This rust actually was scavenged by her from our childhood building, which is, it's been an artist co-op since the 70s in Lower Manhattan. Yeah, but more generally, I love rust. I love things I find on the street. I love other people's clothes. I love found paper. I love found text. There's this place in Baltimore that I would highly recommend if anyone's passing through, called Scrap Bmore, which is a creative reuse store where they actually, I think that there's some place like this, is it Materials for the Arts in New York, but where there's a lot of scavenged and salvaged art material. So in fact, you can buy construction paper by the inch, and it's old and faded in this really beautiful way to me. When I thought about making a print for the show, I immediately knew I wanted to use this paper, which I've really accrued because I can't say no, it's also beautiful. But I love the way that it fades. Each piece of paper is a little bit different in this way that kind of reminds me of the cyanotype in Julia's painting, which I think that she'll talk to a little bit later. But I have another example here of, again, the different kinds of fading on every single piece of construction paper. I also just love construction paper, though, getting back to that idea of play. It reminds me of childhood. It's a very imperfect material. It's kind of crackly. You know, I like the idea of a gallery visitor putting it in their pocket and it might get a little bit wrinkled or a little bit wet. I was using these like big industrial printers at an art college here to print these, and it still jammed the printers. And there's something that's, again, like very juicy to me in that imperfect technology. And then the sculpture. Yeah, so again, I use the word detritus, but this is how I work. I collect pieces of paper, mail, paintings, edited poems, little lists. And when I saw these pieces of rust again scavenged by our mother, they immediately looked to me like a filing system. And I have to give, again, much credit to Amanda Millay Sorsa for helping kind of curate which exact pieces would go in this sculpture.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in this idea of these objects, let's say, having an own history, a past, and, you know, a soul to themselves even before you using them. And so in a way, I want to direct this to one of the most visible elements that is found, that are the frames. And so I know that these frames were actually the point of inception for the paintings that are within, although, let's say, in the history of art, we always, we're grown to know that frames are secondary. But here, I loved how, Julia, you described the process of developing these paintings as massaging the image out of the canvas. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how the frame influenced the development of the image within, and how was that relationship between the two?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it's something I've thought about so much in the past few years. I have an example on the left of one of the ways in which I've thought about and encountered frames in the world. There's this floor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Visible Storage, and it's all of the objects that, for any number of reasons, the museum has decided not to show in their, you know, their main galleries. It's like, I guess, excess, but they still want to somehow make it visible. And this is, and one of the sections that has always compelled me is this wall, endless wall of empty frames. And all the frames are labeled and titled, you know, like where they're from, what their materials are made out of. And a lot of museums, I have seen this also in. It's not, you know, it's not just that's just my personal point of reference. And on the right, this is a picture of my studio, working with these found frames, which again, I have to credit our mother to, also being someone who has over the years just accumulated frames, sometimes accumulated empty frames, other times has art that we've decided has been less interesting to us than the frame itself. So removing what's in the frame and keeping, again, the frame as this sort of empty structure. And I would say that in a way, a lot of this interest in framing in general came about in the past 4 years or so, when so much of our communication and experience of art happened through the frame of our phones and our computer screens. And that was, really acutely driven by the pandemic. But of course, this has been an ongoing question that artists have looked at ever since screens became sort of one of these ways through which we view art. So this is just an example of another project in which I'm thinking about the frame specifically of the iPhone. These are paintings, but they're paintings that are they're sort of like trompe l'oeil paintings. They're made on small panels of wood that I carved, that are all meant to mimic a phone screen. And I envisioned this body of work as specifically relating to the scale at which so many paintings are viewed when we are seeing them on platforms like Instagram or online viewing rooms or gallery websites or whatever. So this whole body of work really came about with the frame and the dimensions and the aspect ratio, you might say, of the frames that have come to condition so much of how we experience the world, which, are not arbitrary at all. They've been designed by companies, and we don't really have much choice, right? We have like these set aspect ratios by which we see projections, by which we see, our computer screen content. I will also say the name of this series, I did a series in a very hot August, is Anne-Marie's, title of one of Anne-Marie's poems. So yet another example of using words from Anne-Marie as a source of inspiration. So I will say that, this is sort of some of the conceptual underpinning of how I've been thinking about frames the past few years. And then this is literally, the body of work that you see at Below Grand, and the paintings just kind of all coming from these found empty surfaces, or, holders, containers, and then thinking about how an image relates in its birth, really, to the things that are around it. The paintings feel like they had to have a relationship to the context in which they would ultimately be held, if that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know if I think that's the only image I have of showing that process. Yeah.
Thank you. And so in terms of the picture that develops within, obviously they're very abstracted forms, but you can see that there is an interest in light and almost reminiscent of, like, let's say, the glow and the glitch and this digital kind of like reflection. Is that something you were trying to replicate, or is it more open?
Yeah, I mean, everything you said, it so resonates with me, but I would say I was also working in a really, like, these paintings, I don't really know where they came from, truthfully. I think I was all of these conceptual ideas, all this research that I have done in like very explicit ways is in me. But I would say that when these paintings were actually being made, I think I was channeling all of that. And I think the idea of the orb, the glow, the screen, these kinds of like these halos of light, that was definitely in me. But I really can't say that I was consciously hoping that these would replicate that. They really became what they became. And I do attribute a lot of that really to our working environment. I think when I'm working alone, I can tend to overthink things. I can tend to overwork things. But there was this energy in our studio, Anne-Marie in my studio, where I just felt a kind of ease that everything didn't have to be over thought through. And for lack of a better word, I would say there was this like intuition or energy that I just felt very comfortable in a way that I do experience differently when I'm working in my studio alone. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The poems that I wrote in the space, the way that I laid out the manuscript, the edits that I made, again, like all of this is up here and I do have that within me, but there was something really, you know, for lack of a better word, very magical about working in the space with my sister and watching these poems get massaged out of the canvas and seeing her mix the paint. I mean, it was just incredibly inspiring to me.
And now in terms like staying on the digital, let's say, topic, I think this is a perfect moment to shift to the gallery's back room, in which the, let's say, mini screens or canvases and paintings scale up to a much bigger screen that you called blue screen, and you used for your video performance entitled Walking Inside the Wedge Like a Leaf or a Clock Turning Back. And I found it very interesting, let's say, in the beginning, because I found so many let's say influences from like Laurie Simmons, living objects, but just because, let's say, the screen has legs and it's Julia's legs, right? But apart from the legs, obviously, this screen is much more, and it becomes a portal to the past. And so I was wondering if you could speak about how it has this function.
Sure. And I wonder, would this be a good moment to show a clip of the video for people to get an idea of what you're referring to with the legs?
I think
Specifically, what are the legs?
Yeah, we can visualize the legs.
Yeah. So this is a picture of the installation of it in the back room of Below Grand. But I will share. So basically what you're seeing is on the right, this is that blue screen that Ginevra mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about it as an object. But then what you're seeing in the room is these projections of both the light coming through the painting, because the painting is full of holes. So those like little squares that you're seeing on the wall are all just the painting casting its own shadow and its own light on the wall. And then also casting, there's a projector that is playing a video, which is a video of this painting being walked through downtown Manhattan. And we will talk about what that is. But for the time being, I'll just share a 2-minute clip of that video so that folks can get an idea of what it is, in fact, that we are referring to.
And I think importantly, it's important to note that this is part of a series. You have done this in several other cities with other videographers as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and I would say that this particular, the way that this video came about, like we really conceived of together, and the way it was edited especially, and I think people will gain insight into what that editing process was really something that had so much to do with like how we envisioned this exhibition and our relationship to this particular location of downtown. So I'll play this video. It's 30 minutes long approximately as a total, but I'll play just a 2-minute clip of it.
Thank you, dear.
Okay, so that's that clip, and I'll go back to the image of it in the gallery. And Anne-Marie, maybe I could speak a little bit about the blue screen concept, and then you could maybe speak to the editing and the image.
Oh,
the
sure.
image keying in. So yeah, the blue screens, I've been making green screens and blue screens since about like 2021. And originally I was thinking about them, again, kind of coming out of this pandemic moment where we experienced so much of communication over Zoom, and green screens as Zoom backdrops became really just common, mundane experiences, as opposed to what green screens are traditionally used for, which is in video and studio production for actors to basically be transported to environments other than their own. So it's usually something that's really divorced from the everyday world, but it became super, again, common during the pandemic. So I started making these paintings thinking about painting space as historically being a space that transports people to other worlds, and kind of conflating that notion with the contemporary notion of green screens doing that digitally. And so the painting, I will say, in this particular instance, is a large scale 2-panel screen. It's made as like the under image that you see, which some people have likened to a map, correctly so, is actually a cyanotype. A cyanotype is a form of analog photography that was used starting in the 1800s. And it basically uses photosensitized surfaces to create images that get exposed in the sun. If you've ever done like a sun print in school when you were a kid, that's basically what this is. So this is an image showing the process of the painting or the cyanotype being made. The image on the left is the fabric, which is photosensitized. And then there's this like lattice work web that I made on top of it. And then basically the image on the right shows, once the image has been exposed, what it kind of looks like as a raw image. And then of course that got reworked. And one of the things that I was thinking about was this map of downtown, which Anne-Marie and I passed like every day as children. And this is just something that I also think has just kind of become like part of like the visual history of my life, even though I don't think about it every day. It's like, oh, it's in there. There it is. It's coming out in these like unknown ways. So Anne-Marie, maybe if you want to speak to the video editing and like the image research and that question about like history coming in.
Sure, absolutely. So just one, I totally agree with you about that, that map that we pass every day on the way to school, how these images kind of seep in, and almost like dreams. They're just part of the visual language that we both recognized. And when I saw the green screen, I immediately was like, oh, map. But yeah, seeing that photograph again is just super, super helpful for me. So again, so these are green screens, essentially, even though they're not always green. And an idea that Julia and I had long talked about was, and that you had practiced, Julia, I think in concert with the New York Public Library, was keying, was that the first instance? Yeah, was keying out some of the green or blue or whatever color may be in the painting, and splicing in historical images of the places we were walking through. So the New York Historical Society, a place that we always visited as children, has just a huge, rich archive of historical images of, you know, every street you can think of. The most exciting ones to me personally were from the subway collection. These images of Lower Manhattan taken as, you know, all of these train lines that we're very familiar with were being built. And these photos are from, I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, I mean, over 100 years ago. So what we did is we actually planned a walk from our childhood home on Hudson Street to below Grand Gallery, mapping out a route based on which images we could find in the archive. So just as I saw someone said in the chat, kind of like a reverse ekphrastic, that's a really beautiful comment. This is kind of a reverse engineered map, like a reverse engineered shape. I love the shape that our map kind of accidentally on purpose made, and a reverse engineered editing, if that makes sense. So one of the things we were interested in particular was, and I think you could speak to this a little bit more, Julia, because you're in this world, but the labor of moving this painting from home to the gallery. What we wanted to make that labor very, very visible. I'm not sure how much this painting weighs, but it is very heavy. This was a very, very cold day. It was hard not to help Julia, but I knew that my job was as the eye. Yeah, do you want to speak more to the labor of that walk, Julia?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that every artist contends with all the time because we are in the business of making stuff generally. And that stuff we have to move, whether it's like from studio to studio, from studio to gallery, from gallery somewhere else. Like, I think we've all had the experience of moving our art around. And the first time I actually did a green screen walk was out of necessity. It was a 6 by 6 foot painting. It was leaving an exhibition space that was only 2 miles from my studio. And I really didn't have the capacity to rent a U-Haul. So I walked it from the gallery to my studio. And I became really interested in what it means to bring paintings out of the sort of traditional viewing space and into the living environment, where people can actually see it for what it is and like remember, like this is an object that does have mass, it does have weight. It's not a digital image. Again, it looks like on a screen, it looks weightless, but it actually really takes a lot of labor and physical effort to make and to move. And so much of the business of the art world is also like invested in how do we transport art, you know? So this was there's a playfulness to it, but it is also very much based in like an experience that I think is very familiar to a lot of artists. And this walk was 3.5 miles long. The painting is cumbersome. It is an object that opens and closes, so it doesn't always stay closed. So there are moments where it like hits a branch of a tree, and then I kind of have to, you know, pick it up, or like the wind, it becomes a sail in the wind, and it really does move my body in these ways that are unpredictable. And that's also something that I just think has so much to do with painting. It is an embodied process. You are contending with a surface, with a material. You do get tired. It is boring sometimes, but it's also like kind of this act of endurance. Sometimes, not always, you know, paintings can also happen like really fast, but it's, yeah, it just feels actually like it has a lot to do with what painting is to me. And yeah.
And I'll say that that also ties back so beautifully, I think, to, you know, the early collaboration through the mail, which again, like to use Ginevra, your words, you know, exploratory and transitory. I think Julia and I are both more interested, I think Julia are both more interested in kind of the process than the product. And, you know, that process when it comes to whether, you know, the mail or getting a painting from home to the gallery, that's all in the walk. So I love these shots of some of the things that actually happen when you send things through the mail. Sometimes, postcards are too small to go through the machine, so they're hand canceled, and you'll see one of our kind of accidental collaborators, I assume a postal worker, actually wrote this on one of the cards I sent to Julia. Or then this other thing that was too small to go through the mail gets this kind of accidental new frame, this envelope from the USPS that says "We care." We couldn't put this through the machine. It's a little bit ripped. Please accept our apologies, in essence. But just like Julia is talking about how the painting, at a certain point in the video, it catches on a branch. Well, that was part of the process, and it could have gotten ripped in that process, and that would have been what was shown in this show. And I think that's a really exciting moment.
Yeah.
And in terms of, let's say, there's obviously like a level of nostalgia that I can sense in these letters and so on. I was wondering if the experience of going back to these archives and looking at these images of the city of, I would say, one of the most fast developing in a way, was the drive nostalgic, or is it even almost documentational in a way, like the process of like showing the city of how, in respect of how it is now and how it was before when you were kids, and the choice of this route from your home. I was wondering if you can elaborate on this.
Yeah, I think that nostalgia is definitely there. I think that exploration and play is also there. I think that there was also kind of a sense of surprise in a way also. I've lived in a number of other cities, and not all of them, for various reasons, have architecture that is the same as it was essentially, 110, 120 years ago. So there was surprise sometimes when we were keying out, an image of West Broadway, and oh, there's the window, there's the same building. I think in many ways, New York does traffic on nostalgia. There's a way that the city, and I think specifically Manhattan, or Lower Manhattan in some ways, kind of lives in the public imaginary. A lot of that kind of perpetuated through movies and other media. And it is also complicated. I mean, I haven't lived there since 2003, so that's, can I do math? 21 years. It's complicated. It's complicated. It's hard to see old places I loved as a child no longer there, but I also understand that is just kind of baked into what New York has always been, about so much fast change.
Yeah. I'll also say that I think part of the way this idea of change atop change, like basically New York is like sedimentary rock in the sense that it's just layer, 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 layer. And sometimes the layers from 100 years ago pop through, and other times like they're completely buried. And part of the way, I'll say two things about the painting that I feel like come out of this idea. One being the holes as a really important structural element. So in the image of the projection, you can see that there's light coming through the back of the painting. It's casting shadows and like these light squares on the wall. And part of the idea behind the holes is that when you key out the blue or the green, the holes don't get keyed out because actually they just remain grounded in whatever is behind them. So right now the painting is closed, but if the painting were open, basically you'd see the city behind it. So there's this way in which the keying is purposefully imperfect as a process. You can never remove everything and get a clean image. It will always be this sort of hybrid between past and present, between the toggling of this image that we're trying to put in and the reality the sticky reality of what the city is today. So that's
Which is
one
almost a critique, sorry, a critique to the digital in a way, like the
absolutely.
perfection of the digital. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, I mean, that's so much a part of it. Yeah, like the glitchiness, the fact that the digital is degrading also, right? Like we're talking about degradation, we're talking about like growth on top of growth. And then also Anne-Marie has always sort of said it feels like you're carrying the weight of history on your shoulders, which is like kind of like, you know, in joking, but no, it's like it also does sometimes feel like holding this painting is like, I don't know what to do with this. I truly, like Anne-Marie, like I don't know how to feel about it. Like I love it, I hate it. It's all of the emotions all the time, and I don't actually often know what to do. And so there's something about like, I don't know, embodying the weight, which I think we're always contending with, you know?
That's really well said, because it is such, you know, again, I was just the eye in this performance, but it was such an athletic performance.
But you also saw very specific things that other people wouldn't have seen. So there were things I think that you were interested in zooming into that like I also was completely unaware of, because I am not aware of what's going on. Really, I'm just like in the moment. And you have to be the eyes and the ears and the vision of like, and there are moments where you also were like, stop here because the light is really beautiful. So you were kind of like directing the activity in this way that was like, you know, it wasn't overbearing. It was just like you were seeing the scene in a way that I was completely blind to. I couldn't really see the scene, you know, I couldn't see what this thing looked like.
One thing just on a technical note that we both kind of noted is actually, I don't know the history of green screen, but actually if you're doing this in New York, and I bet so many other, you know, cities, green and blue are actually incredibly hard colors to key out, because you're going to key out everything unless you know, choose a very, very sensitive key. And so I kind of joked to Julia that her next green screen should be like hot pink or like, I don't know, you know, bright orange, although this wouldn't be a good example of it, because then you would key out all of the playground equipment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so to conclude, I think we got a sense that this exhibition is also very conceptual. There is so much meaning behind a lot of this work. And so in a way, it really made me reflect on the potential for it being somewhat of a social or institutional critique, because you do hint to these messages while often using the same language of like social media, for example. And so I kind of wanted to conclude with a question about a hidden component in the exhibition, which is this QR code painting that is only exhibited when the show is actually closed, and it's hanged on the door of the gallery. And so I think this is a very interesting, let's say, example of using this language while criticizing, let's say, the phenomenon behind it. So if you can talk a little bit more about that, Julia.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll say this piece is also, it's like very much in the vein of Anne-Marie's hidden poem in the front cut. It's something that is only accessible at certain hours, and specifically and again, this was like a decision that I am so grateful to Amanda Milay-Sorsa for thinking through with us, you know, around like the gallery being open to the public certain hours, but the back room is not open for the majority of the week. So what do we do with the video? Is there a way that people can access it when the gallery is closed? So this is a painting that only comes out when the gallery is closed, and it is a QR code. It is a painting, but it is also a painting that can be read by a machine. I think as viewers, we recognize it as just a QR code, but if you scan it, and I don't know if that will translate on this screen, but you can try with your phones to hold it up to the computer screen. And basically the QR code just links to the video that is normally projected when the gallery is open. So it's this way to access the work when it is inaccessible. And again, to use that language, I love, Ginevra, what you said about institutional critique, because it really is, it seems like it's an embrace of technology, but it's not really. I actually don't like QR codes. I don't think they're particularly beautiful. They're kind of like something that we've become used to. And it kind of came out of this idea of, like, we're already going to take a photograph of most things with our phone. We're already going to hold our phone up to most things that we're seeing in the world. So why not make that thing legible by the phone's technology itself? And Amanda Millet source of, and I have also talked about this in the context of some other QR code paintings. So I encourage you to read an interview that she did that kind of taps into this idea in more depth. But again, about like the ways that this space is like so unique, like below gallery that is just like so fertile for like doing things that are not always possible or even just like make sense in other spaces. Like, it's just, I want to just say again how grateful we are to Below Grand for seeing this, like this, having this vision, to make a gallery in this way, because it was so much fun to to play with the idiosyncrasies of what it is. So I'll just say that again. Thank you to Below Grand, to Amanda, to Ginevra for your questions. I mean, we have more thanks, but these are just some of the few that we want to put out right now.
Yes, so much so. And thank you, I would say also, if you go back to that previous image, to the restaurant supply store that Below Grand is housed in. I mean, so much of the space itself feels like a secret. Going back to Ginevra, your introduction to the whole talk, there is a sense when you're walking down the street of, oh, there's something so bright and striking on the street, but then, is there more? You go into this kind of side door and there's this secret second part of the gallery. And we wanted to play with instead of against that. And I love this shot of the green of these ceramics with the green screen and with the QR code.
Yeah. And
so
also
much
the idea,
oh, go ahead.
What kind of objects are sold in the shop, very retail and commercial and mass produced versus, paintings and such thought and conceptual levels. It's it just reinforces the exhibition's character in a way, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. I mean, this is such a generous reading and for these really, really thought-provoking questions that I know Julia and I just got so excited thinking through together and putting together this slideshow. This is really exciting, a really exciting conversation, Ginevra. So thank you for moderating.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. And
so many questions for us to think about. But it brought up new things. So thank you. Thank you.
This has been so lovely. Thank you so much, Ginevra, for your questions, and Julia and Anne-Marie for all of your generosity and sharing about your process in bringing this show to life with Amanda Millet-Sorsa, who we know very well at the Rail. I would like to open it up to questions, and we have several questions. So I'm really excited for you to answer some of these that have come in from the audience. The first one's going to be from GE. GE, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you very much all. Very simple question, maybe. Is this show a cue for us to abandon theorizing in favor of another way to understand order and ordering?
Can you say more about order and ordering? Because,
well, again, you were talking about indexing, which is, which it seems about like everything here is indexed, it's constellated, it's connecting, it's dialoguing and all of that. And ordering is a way of like disrupting things. I mean, I think what you're doing here is you're disrupting things and then putting things back together again in a different kind of way, giving it a brand new order, giving it a new way of looking at things, but also a way of helping to disrupt our general tendency to want to just theorize on the stuff?
Yeah, I love that question. And thank you for elaborating on, on ordering. When I think about ordering, what comes to mind is what was like the center of my work at residency, which was ordering this manuscript, this third manuscript, Spidering, that I've been working on. And I always write on a computer, but I have to be very, very tactile in ordering a manuscript. And I don't always, I never really have the luxury of having a lot of space to spread work out and see the shapes that poems take on the floor and live with them. So much of this process was about ordering to me in that way. But then also, the order being imperfect and disrupted by my own footprints, by the fact that we were in rural Pennsylvania and I'd wake up and there'd be spiders on my poems. There'd be dust. Those are just some thoughts that comes to mind. So kind of ordering and indexing as another imperfect technology. Thank you.
And I'll briefly say, I wanted to hear what Amanda had to say about this, because I feel like you're a curator. I mean, Amanda, I'm putting you on the spot, but so like you don't have to answer it. But I just feel like so much like making work, you don't always see what it is. You don't always like understand how it relates. And I have a really hard time shutting off my brain. So it's a privilege to have someone else like do the ordering, shall we say. And I wonder if that's something maybe that Amanda could comment on, because I think so much of what the show became was because of your vision for how these things come together. So you don't have to answer if you don't want to on the spot, but I think it's like a curatorial question as much as it is for us.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Hey, I'm in transit, but nice to see everybody here, and the conversation was so great. Congrats to Ginevra and Julia and Anne-Marie and the Brooklyn Rail for hosting. But yes, I mean, to talk briefly about, I guess, ordering or indexing, I think the word secret is very apropos for the space, for the exploration, as that was brought up in the beginning. And I think a lot of the discussions that we had among the three of us were how to bring that forth in the experimental nature of the space, of how it's encountered, and how sometimes New York also carries that sense with it as a city that has its own energy of exploration and encounters and just kind of unexpected and strange things that happen all the time. As far as poetry goes, I really enjoyed thinking through how could we display and engage with poetry in different ways aside from what I think most people are accustomed to in a book form or in a public forum. And so visually thinking about that with Anne-Marie was really special, about putting the secret poem up on the ceiling, putting it on the ground with chalk as if it were a sidewalk, and also then putting it in that rust-bound object thing. And also just how to then dialogue that with the visual work, which was painting and the experimental film. So those are my few words. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you, GE, for that question. And thank you, Amanda. And thank you, Anne-Marie and Julia, for your answers. The next question is going to be from Ilana, and I'll read on Ilana's behalf. So many uses of the frame as window in painting, screen, and architecture, exclamation point. How do you see your relationship to mail art as in someone like Ray Johnson? Most of all, I'm struck by how much your subject and your collaboration are a testimony to your connection to your family and your childhood and your shared experience growing up in New York. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Thank you, Ilana.
Yeah.
Ilana Herzog, who asked that question. Thank you. Anne-Marie,
Gosh, I don't know where to begin about New York. I mean, again, I think about that shared language that we have and we don't talk about really, but that's in our blood from our parents. From, you know, just a perfect example is that photograph that you took of that map that we passed every day on the way to school, PS 41. It's hard to parse through. It's such a great question, and I think that I'll be thinking about it, you know, thinking about these issues for the rest of my life, because I'm obsessed with, you know, questions of origin, the city. Yeah, I want to hear what you say, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's, in a way, it's like, you know, we write so much about our work and what our work is about and why we do it and all that. And I you know, at the end of the day, it's like, I think it is a search for something about like where we come from. And wait, I had another thought about that. Oh, it was about mail art. Yeah. And just like the precedent, like this is, we are obviously working within a long lineage of artists who have used the mail. Like we're very aware of that. And I would say that whenever I go, and I'll also say like Dada and Fluxus are two moments in history that have always really spoken to me, and I see Amory nodding, so I think she would agree. You know, like these moments that really like dovetail with dominant art trends, and like moments where like art is seen in like these really hyper visible, hyper market driven spaces, and the ways that these consortiums of artists working like really in these like kind of like disparate networks often, and like with materials that are of the everyday, they're almost like just ways of surviving. I don't know, like they're just like almost like necessity, right? Like certain artists just send things because it's a way of acknowledging and celebrating one's presence in the world. And I think essentially that's like always what we're doing. Whenever anyone posts anything on social media, it's sort of like, here I am, you know? And I think in like this really old analog way, like sending a piece of mail is also that same gesture, that same instinct to want to be located, to want to be physically in a place, geographically specific. And so I would say like just artists who have worked in this way, anytime an exhibition has ephemera of an artist's practice, that is always as interesting to me usually as like what's on the wall.
Totally. And I think that there's a tenderness to, you know, for instance, Ray Johnston's work, and an affection in sending art to friends or family. I would also, I think also note like language poetry as a point of reference, and making the poetic or the literary visual in that very, very explicit way. Yeah. Really good question. Yeah, Lang Po.
Thank you so much for that question. And thank you so much for those answers, which were a pleasure to listen to. The next question today is going to be from Andrew Woolbright. Andrew, I will give you the chance to unmute to ask.
Hi, everyone. Wonderful conversation today. And just love getting to hear about everything in this interview. I was wondering about like the role of obligation. Like I'm really interested in all these languages that, you know, like the QR code, which I think during COVID, everyone, you know, is like, oh, I hate using this, but we have to. And the cell phone, which is like, oh, I hate using this, but we have to. And I'm just wondering about that. It feels very New Yorker to like kind of see painting and poetry through these like obligated forms and test out the resistance to it. But I also wonder if you're also thinking of painting and poetry as a certain type of obligation. Like, is this about the exhaustion of these forms because of the market, like you just brought up, or is it a productive tension that like something romantic can be put against a QR code? I don't know.
It's a great question.
That's such a good word too, obligation. That's a word I don't.
I really have a response to that word, obligation.
Oh yeah, please go.
I just like, it really struck something to me. And Emery, it made me think about this when you were sending me so much in grad school. So basically like 2016 to 2018, I mentioned that was like the bulk of when I got all this mail from you. I feel like that's when it like just like ramped up in this like whole nother level, right?
Yeah.
And I think obligation is a great point of entry, because the mail, unlike email, unlike text messages, does not actually obligate you to respond at all. You have no idea if it's gotten there. You have no idea when it's gotten there. And like most of the time, Emery was not sending me anything that merited a response. It was like, often it was like bits of like, who
Ouch.
knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was like actually this like incredible relief of obligation where it's like, I don't have to do anything but receive this and hold it, you know? And like that was just liberating. And there's no time, there's no unspoken time pressure as to when you really should respond and if you even do. And then also, again, this thing about necessity where it's like, okay, being in like a very like stressful, like hyper, like a petri dish of like criticism and dialogue. And like, that's kind of what grad school is. And in a way, like, I think that's like sometimes what we experience of like the art world in various capacities. Like there is something about the necessity of just like communicating directly with someone in a way that is not at all driven by the next thing, right? It's so much like this is what this thing is, and it's not about the next thing that it's going to lead to. It's not about this like idea of like it being seen. It's really, really direct. And I find it very hard to access that sometimes in other spaces. And the mail reminds me, and Anne-Marie reminds me that it actually can just be this like really direct thing. It's like a wonderful reminder that I feel so grateful to be reminded of every time I get a piece of trash in the mail.
Yeah, every time you get your like to-do list. Yeah. Yeah, I just love that word. And what's coming to mind with that word is also going back to the word frame. And, you know, are these found frames, these beautiful found frames that Julia, you know, bought for $1, $2 at antique barns in rural Pennsylvania, were those an obligation? You know, was there an obligation to make something that fit that frame? Similarly, I love form. I love sonnets, but I love playing with sonnets. If people haven't read Diane Seuss's Frank Sonnets, would highly recommend that. I love the sonnet specifically as a form because, you know, there's this heavy, heavy history of it. It's this box that so many people have done something in, but how can we rub up against the edges of the box? And in that, I'm going to say again, obligation, the obligation and the heaviness of that history, how can we maybe make something new, maybe queer it in a way, see how much we can play in that box. So yeah, I'm going to think more about that word, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Andrew. And thank you so much, Julia and Anne-Marie, for those incredible responses. Those were a pleasure to listen to. And our last question today is going to be from Rachel, and I'm going to ask it on Rachel's behalf. Rachel says, it feels like a lot of this work sandwiches remembered or present places into the mediation of images. Can you talk a bit more about place? Is there a specific place that left a first impression on you as an artist that launched this approach?
I'm going to say the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm curious also at how you'll answer, Julia. But the first thing that comes to mind is thrift stores and city streets. You know, just really in New York, people throw away or donate the most beautiful treasures. And we always had those in our house growing up, which I feel very lucky. I feel very lucky to have had that as a, you know, as a way to see the world, to see treasure in the rust, or to see treasure in like the gorgeous chair that someone has thrown away. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Very intuitive answer. What about you, Julia?
The first word that came to mind was the river. I think part of why the river comes to mind is because there's a piece of writing that Anne-Marie wrote many years ago, and it's just a Word document that I have like on my computer somewhere, and it's the river, and it's about the Hudson River, but it's a text that, you know, she wrote and like we haven't done anything with, and but it's been on my mind, and I just have this text, and it's titled The River. And the river, we grew up very close to it, and it feels like this part of New York that is both located and not located, because it's like it wraps around the island of Manhattan. It becomes the East River as it borders up against Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx. Staten Island is like in the river, which is becoming the bay, which I always forget leads to the Atlantic Ocean. I'm like, how are we on the Atlantic Ocean? Crazy. And the river, I think, I don't know, that's always been really an important place for us, I think. We spent a lot of time there growing up. And it's like one of the areas I would say that has like most transformed in the past 50 years. And we didn't even experience the vast majority of that transformation. When our parents moved to the city in like the 60s and 70s, like the piers were totally different, like landscape, obviously. And again, like the river has just sort of held all of that change in this like very particular way. And no one can build on the river in the same way that you can build on the land of New York City. And it's a transitory space. It's a space that holds and moves things and is always changing, but is always like super, super constant at the same time. So the river. Yeah.
These are such great questions, everyone. There's so much
They're
more.
hard questions too.
Yeah, I know.
Love those. Thank you all so much for your questions. I loved hearing them answered. And at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending with a poetry reading, and Marie Rooney is going to close us out with a reading today. Thank you so much, Marie. I'll pass it back over.
Thank you all. Chloe, the Brooklyn Rail, the gallery, of course, Andrew and Amanda, and all of the viewers and listeners today.
Ginevra.
So I'm just gonna, and Ginevra, oh my gosh, and Ginevra, thank you so much, Ginevra, for all of these just really juicy questions that we're gonna keep thinking about and making stuff about. So I'm just gonna read one poem, and this was the poem written in chalk on the floor of the gallery. It's called I Loved. I loved the mark it's making, rubbed the mark while it flipped off my skin, sun scrubbing white from the upscabbed mark. I lulled, sang to the mark, wrote new marks across summer's stretched elbow, endured burn, brinked odor by tide, blood as bud. When the mark made Fisher of my story, I marked the page in red ink, crude mark making. What hasn't the sky poured to plant? One spring, I flattened to a smile, that bleached out gender mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was so beautiful. Thank you so much, Marie. That was a lovely way to conclude today.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you, of course, again to Julia. Thank you to Ginevra. Thank you to Amanda Millett-Sorsa, who helped us prepare so much for today. Thank you to the team at Below Grand. And thank you, of course, to the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor this program and make weekday conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where you'll be able to see this soon on our YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our writers, our production staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with artist Chloe Chiasson, hosted by our editorial assistant, Madison Ford, on the occasion of Chiasson's exhibition, Turn Left at the Fork, on view at Dallas Contemporary. And with that, I am going to throw open the mics and give everyone the chance to say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us this Monday.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful, beautiful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for the reading, Anne Marie.
Thank you, Anne Marie. Thank you, Julia. Thanks, Ginevra.
That was
Thank
fantastic.
you.
Congratulations to all.